on the show today, David Treleaven. So I've read David's book on trauma sensitive mindfulness, and I think it is a great book. It is much needed. I know he works with embodiment. I know he works with mindfulness, of course, teaches with some friends of mine. Yeah, I think this topic is fascinating and people need to hear it. So David, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. We have a lot of overlapping, both colleagues, but also things that we're interested in. So I'm happy to be talking about it.
How did you get interested in the body and mindfulness, David? What was the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, well, I'm from Canada. I've just always been interested in transformative work. It's like whatever works, whatever is going to really work. And embodiment to me is the most practical methodology that we can actually be using. It just really works. So I was someone who meditated for a long time. I ended up having some kind of challenging experiences in my practice. And long story short, it led me to study this intersection around mindfulness and trauma. A couple people said, "Hey, have you thought about this?" So I got really curious. I studied it. And my experience around a lot of trauma work, just because you change the way you're thinking about it, doesn't mean that you're actually changing how you're experiencing your body in the world. So the body, mindfulness, trauma, that intersection is something I've been really interested in. And really it's about best practices. Like, what's anyone who's asking people to pay attention to their body and the present moment, what should we know about trauma if we're going to be doing that?
Great. And we're right in there, I think, on the crux of this, that years ago, up till fairly recently, people were teaching mindfulness. They were saying, okay, sit down, sit still, focus on your breath, don't move, 10-day Vipassana retreat. Everyone's going to be fine with that, right? That's not going to cause any problems.
Right.
That was the attitude.
Right. Well, that's where maybe 15 years ago when this all started, that was the person who I was trying to reach. And the kind of the life commitment that I had was, I don't want someone who's struggling with, dysregulation of their nervous system, or who in a 10-day retreat that wouldn't necessarily work for them. I wanted that there to be some modifications for that person. So it's not just sit still, stay in practice, take it back to the cushion. So I wanted there to be some options, but I want to be clear. I'm not saying that meditation and mindfulness should be comfortable. It's actually still about holding a container for people. It's not like trying to just walk on eggshells here. So that seems like also a really important balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what would you say, like just one-on-one for someone who's like, hey, I'm a meditation teacher. It seems to help people. I love it, but I don't really know anything about trauma. Like, why should I learn about trauma? I've been trained as in a Buddhist lineage, or, I've been trained in secular mindfulness by John Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
I need to learn about trauma?
That's kind of like the question. It's like, why should you care? Why? Well, when I'm speaking to someone, I'll often talk about it like this. Any of the listeners here knows that asking someone to pay close and sustained attention to their inner world, that's a big ask. And for some people, that's a monumental moment. I know both you and I are in different martial arts practices or somatic psychology. That moment of saying, hey, what's happening inside can be profound for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's often what's happening, I think, in meditation, is if someone, if they haven't been doing a lot of somatic practice or embodiment practice, that might be the first time in a long time that they've actually paid purposeful attention to their body. And what I'm often saying to meditation teachers or any really body-based teachers is, hey, someone who's struggling with symptoms of trauma, this just asking them to pay attention, that can actually end up being dysregulating. And that's not a bad thing, but you might need to have some different tools in your toolkit to help someone navigate their inner world, because trauma often lives on in the body in terms of sensations. So it's not to scare, this is not at all to fearmonger for meditation teachers. It's actually to say, hey, it's really useful to know how to recognize trauma and how to respond effectively inside your practice. Even that's just having a couple referrals or having some basic modifications for practice.
Great. So most of the people listening to this show have heard episodes on trauma. They might have some sense that this experience of overwhelm that leads to hyperarousal or numbing, or the different kind of symptoms that are there. So we probably don't need to go too much into the very basics. I think the interventions is a great thing to say there. So if someone's teaching meditation and they realize, like, hey, this person has some kind of a trauma background, either they disclose that
Hmm.
or they start looking at symptoms and go, whoa, okay, this person's having a hard time sitting still. That was, for example, something I had as a trauma survivor. Was my first meditation retreat. I'm like, I can't sit in silence for
Right.
this long. And it
Right.
was difficult for everyone, but it looked particularly challenging for me and a few other people.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
it was bouncing off the walls. And later I realized, like, oh, I regulate verbally, which I've
Hmm.
since learned is super Irish, by the way. I taught in Northern Ireland, people would not shut up. And then I was like, oh, that's how they find safety. They talk,
Right. Right.
right? So in a silent retreat, if you've got that Irish self-regulation pattern, you're fucked, you
Yeah.
know?
Right.
So what are some of the things to spot and then interventions or adjustments?
Yeah. So, Mark, I have actually a question for you in that. Do like when did you realize? Was it during the retreat or was it after that you realized, whoa, I needed something different? Maybe it's verbal for you that enabled you to self-regulate. I'm so curious about how people actually realize, because so many people who are drawn to this work, they have all the different tools like, wow, okay, dance or this movement practice or this breath or this meditation practice helps me regulate. But what taught you that? Was it like you hit your head against the wall, or how'd it go?
I was just sort of clearly suffering with the non-talking thing more than people around me. And I thought, well,
Right.
maybe they're all introverts and I'm just an extrovert. Maybe, it's about 15 years ago, my first retreat. And then we had we had these little group meetings. It was a guy called Rob Babaya, a great teacher. And I just was like, blah,
Right, 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 right.
after 3 or 4 days, whatever, it's my first chance to speak. And I went, oh, now I feel so much better, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
And the other thing was there was no touch. And I
Right.
was used to regulate. I had a lot of touch in my life. And I was used to that. And I just said, is it okay if I ask for a hug from someone I'm not sexually attracted to in these meetings that we're going to have every 3 days? And Rob was like, yeah, sure. And a couple of
Mm-hmm.
guys hugged me. And I was just like, oh, now I feel better. So by
Mm-hmm.
talking and through touch, I just felt a lot better. And I realized, like, okay, I probably need where I'm at right now. I need those if I'm going to get through a silent retreat.
Yeah. Yeah. See, this is a couple of things that you're touching, a couple of things here. One is isolation and shame. This is one of the things I've stumbled across, you know, countless times, where people will say, well, I was in a retreat setting. It seemed like most people were doing great, or I had certain projections onto how others were doing. And I just felt like I couldn't either bring this to the teacher, I couldn't talk to them about it. And so there's unintentionally, I'd say, people that end up experiencing a lot of shame around their trauma. I mean, trauma often comes with a sense of shame. People feel a sense of that they're broken or that they're not able to regulate. And so, Mark, you're talking about, right, there are different tools, there are different options for different people. And so, really, a core part of trauma sensitive mindfulness is to say mindfulness alone won't always be the operative practice for someone who's struggling with trauma. Like, you might need talk therapy, you might need some more contact. And that's not wrong. That doesn't make mindfulness wrong. It's just a reminder that when it comes to trauma, people need different choices and options. And where people can get into trouble is if they're in an environment where it's like the only tool we have is coming back to the cushion. Sometimes we got to stick with it. Sometimes we got to be uncomfortable, but it's useful when it comes to trauma to have those different self-regulation tools. Is key.
Yeah, I mean, this was a pretty Gaia House is the British equivalent of Spirit Rock, and it was pretty relaxed. There was rules and stuff, but they were pretty open minded. So I was glad about that. And years later, I did like a hardcore Zen retreat, and I was thinking, God, I'm glad this wasn't my first retreat.
Sure. Yeah.
A,
Yeah.
it was a lot longer. It was a lot stricter. There was a lot less room for kind of maneuver, different options. But it was
Right.
like, wow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't think I had a lot of shame, but I did have a sense of like, hey, maybe I'm a mindfulness dumbass.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like there was a little bit of that. Like, why can't I sit still? And
Yeah.
in that environment, it's very easy to think everybody else is doing fine when actually inwardly they're struggling as much as you are.
Right. Yeah, you're not hearing from others. I have a story. So my work is really, I'm working with the people who are guiding you. That's often, it could be yoga teachers, but it's often meditation teachers, people who are kind of holding the container. And I'm working with them on two different levels. One is that we can talk about this, but there's, say 70 to 90 different modifications that one could learn to actually be trauma informed, meaning that you can recognize trauma, you can respond effectively, et cetera. But then on the other side, Mark, and this is where I think you and I probably have some overlap, is it's a lot about trauma sensitive or trauma informed practice. To me is a lot about embodiment. It's a lot about what do we embody as a teacher or a mindfulness practitioner when we're encountering trauma. And a big principle inside of this work is around choice. So say, Mark, say we're working together, you come to me, you say you need a hug, or hey, I'm in this retreat, I could use some contact. The first place I'm going is I want to empower you to make that choice for yourself, but then I also want to take care of the container. So maybe we have rules, we have things like that. So that's what I'm balancing all the time. But if I got a quick story for you about this, I was at a sitting group maybe a couple months back, and there's a new person who's in the group. And at the end of the retreat, or end of this meditation session, we did a little go around, and the person said, I hated that. That was fucking terrible. I wanted to run screaming from the room. And the teacher, I watched, everyone got kind of quiet. And I watched the teacher take a breath, relax, and said, that's great. Thanks for letting us know. Do you know how far away you'd want to run? And everyone in the room was like, whoa, what's going to happen here? And the person said, yeah, there's a hill outside of this. It was in a residential area. I said, I'd run up to the top of that hill. And the teacher goes, well, do you want to do that? Actually, can I, if you want to do that right now, you can. Maybe just bring a buddy with you. And anyway, everyone just kind of went, whoa. And so the person left, came back about 10 minutes later, and I'll never forget it, Mark. They had this look on their face of relaxation. They were kind of flushed, but in a good way. They weren't as pale. And they said, thanks for trusting that I knew what I needed. And that actually gave me the chance to let my body do what it wanted to do. And that's to me, we could talk about whether that's trauma or not, but that was an embodiment to me on the teacher's behalf of actually trusting someone's knowing about what they needed, and it supported their embodiment. And when it comes to trauma, just because you're thinking about it differently doesn't mean the body will respond differently. So that's kind of an example of trauma sensitive practice.
It's nice. Give me a few more examples of things that would be useful for the meditation teachers listening this to be aware of.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that the breath, in terms of the research that I've been doing, often through a lot of qualitative interviews, the breath isn't always neutral for someone who's struggling with trauma. And that might be obvious for a lot of listeners, but for people that haven't heard of trauma, I mean, the breath is often the central touch point or anchor inside of a meditation practice. For someone who's new, you're given the instruction, hey, attend to the breath, whether that's the breath at the nostrils or maybe the abdomen. And then when your mind wanders, which it eventually will, into thought, just come on back. Just bring your attention lightly back to this anchor point. But someone struggling with trauma, the breath isn't always going to be an easy place to cultivate concentration, right? So, our respiratory system, it's totally woven to our sympathetic nervous system, which is, I'm sure you've talked about on different podcasts, is connected to trauma. So that's what I want teachers to know, or really anyone who's doing body-based work.
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking someone to pay close and sustained attention to the breath, that could be really activating for them. Again, that's not a bad thing. Maybe being activated is great. It's exactly what they need. But just know, hey, maybe it's easier to pay attention to the feet. Maybe it's easier to pay attention to sound. And having some different options around anchors, for example, is one of the ways that you can be practicing trauma-sensitive mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always an assumption in embodied work as well as meditation that the body is this kind of safe, happy place.
Right.
And
right.
the whole point about trauma, isn't it? Tell me if I'm wrong, is that it stops being a safe, happy place, right? Or at least at times that sense of basic safety is gone. So like bringing people back to that may not be so pleasant.
Right. This is where the relationship between trauma and embodiment is just so important, because embodiment can often be talked about as a refuge, like, just take refuge in the body. And you might have someone who's in a group who goes, hell no. Are you kidding? This isn't a refuge. I've been trying to get away from my body for the last 10 years for good reason. So just the more we complexify this idea of how the body responds to stress and traumatic stress, more specifically, then the more powerful we get to be when we're asking people to pay attention. It's a big deal to ask someone to pay attention.
What do you think most meditation teachers are missing in sort of trauma awareness? Like if you had 10 minutes with every meditation teacher in the world and we're like, right, now David's up 10 minutes. What are the things you'd really want them to get?
Well, just talking to you about this is actually it. It's just an awareness of the issue, because I think there's a way that, I mean, I was trained this way. It's like, we've been doing this for 2,600 years. Something's working about it. Why would it be any different in terms of modifications? We're just being oversensitive to people right now. And then the more that I've talked to, say, Buddhist teachers, the more that they remind me, actually, different modifications have always been baked into Buddhist and contemplative practice. So, say you're feeling tired and dissociated, you can open your eyes, you can take a walk. So, trauma sensitive practice is not necessarily new, but there is a lot more understanding about the nuances of the physiology of trauma that we can keep bringing in. So, for example, Mark, you just said, you paying attention, you being in contact with someone else on that retreat was profoundly helpful in terms of your regulation. So just knowing that there's these different, we can talk about the um, the ways that interpersonal regulation supports what's known as the window of tolerance regulation. There's all these different levers that we can pull, but it's not to get away from the core teaching around mindfulness, which is that we can actually learn to be with greater fluctuations of our experience. So I guess for the 10 minutes that you're giving me with every meditation teacher in the world, that'd be great, by the way, if you could arrange
Set it
that.
up. No, but with the conference, I mean, it's not far off.
I mean, I would say just be aware. Well, here's actually, we haven't talked about this. Here's the 30-second thing I want people to know. People that are struggling with trauma will tend to reflexively orient to traumatic stimuli, period. What that means is, say you and I were both meditating, we both had some kind of history of trauma. The odds are we will naturally pay attention to anything that's threatening to us. Now, that's both outside of our experience, but also internally. So if my lungs get tight and that was connected to a past trauma, I will naturally pay attention there. So what does this mean? Well, just think of the setup for a moment when you're asking someone who's traumatized to meditate. In all likelihood, what will be predominant is sensations that are connected to trauma. That could also be flashbacks, intrusive thoughts. That is where their attention will go. Again, that's not a bad thing. It's actually a deeply intelligent response to orient. But if that person does not have tools and they're not as empowered as maybe you were, Mark, they didn't ask for the hug, they didn't ask for taking a break, they can get really stuck. So that's it. If there's an awareness of that setup and that dynamic that can actually provoke more dysregulation, you're way ahead of the game. And then from there, we can talk about, the year of training that you can do to have all these different tools and modifications. But that's 50% of it right there, is just knowing you're not a hammer and everything's not a nail when it comes to mindfulness.
I mean, just being aware of dysregulation, being aware of numbing, being aware of hyperarousal, sort of basic concepts of you could probably get across in an hour or two would be a huge upgrade. I think is the phrase John Kabat-Zinn generously says on your website, an essential upgrade. But that is an upgrade to know about that stuff for a meditation teacher, even a very well trained one.
Yeah, I don't think of it as that people have to fundamentally change what they're practicing, or that if you start taking on trauma informed practice, that means you're going to have to, do away with everything you know. I do think of it as an upgrade. And here's in my experience, Mark, it's that people who, you probably found this too, I feel like people who have an understanding of the biological, psychological, and social components of trauma, I feel like they're often better leaders and teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's a dance teacher, whether that's someone who's leading meditation or yoga, it just adds this layer of complexity. It doesn't mean then that you have to be afraid of what you're teaching, etc. But just knowing that trauma is likely going to be in the rooms that you're in, I think it's a big support for any of us that are teaching.
I'm leading an organization right now. I'm managing a team of about 50 people. And, 5 of them have some fairly serious trauma. And the other 45 have some,
Sure, yeah.
And the ones, particularly the ones that have a serious amount, it's really useful to go, okay, this person feels unsafe right now. This person's overwhelmed right now. This person is focusing on the negative. This person is thinking, as a leader and as a manager, realizing that one of my coaches basically said, look, your job is to be 10% calmer than the people you lead so that they don't freak out.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, that's my only job. She was like, pretty much.
10%. That's not bad.
I was like, I can do 10%, you know? So
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
as a leader, it's definitely a lens that I increasingly use. So and this stuff's not just for meditation teachers.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a lens. I started when 15 years ago. I'll tell you the first trauma session when I was doing my own trauma work, first person I ever worked with, first session, I walk in, I'm all ready. And she said, I want you to tell me what's working in your life. And I said, well, I don't want to talk about what's working. What?
I don't even think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, let me tell you about where I'm feeling really messed up. And she said, yeah, I know. I get it. She said, your capacity to be with what's working is going to be linked to your capacity to actually integrate what's hard. And that was a game changer for me. Instead of just going right at trauma and what's difficult, it was actually creating almost like a bigger field, or it was almost like a horse that created this bigger pasture for it to run in. And so I started to see the world a lot through that lens of trauma, maybe similar to what you're saying, where you're like, okay, let me pull back from the system and look at what's happening in the system and how can I support the system. The 10% is a great example. And that's how I'm often training meditation teachers. Great. What would they need in a given moment with a person or a group that would actually help resource the system and allow someone to be regulated, or at least make choices inside their practice? So I really resonate with that. Once you start to work with trauma, you start to see it everywhere. And here we are with COVID. I mean, there's a level of adversity.
Do you think people are, right now, I just like at any time, a quarter of my team are freaking out or in dysregulation. I don't think that would have been the case a year ago.
Sure. Yeah.
It seems like people are closer to that edge now.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you talked about the window of tolerance on any podcasts? Has that come up at all?
Bring it up again.
Yeah. So Dan Siegel, neuroscientist that many will know from UCLA, talks about this window of tolerance, which has been used in a bunch of different fields, but a couple people used it inside of trauma. Pat Ogden was one. But it is really helpful, Mark, for that question around COVID in this moment. So window of tolerance basically says there's an optimal zone of physiological arousal that someone or a system really can be in. And when you're in that window, you're more likely to feel in a sense of choice, agency, you're connected to yourself, and you can tolerate the fluctuations of stress that you're going to experience. And then on either side of that, we have what's known as hyper or hypo arousal, too much, too little. So when we've been talking this conversation about dysregulation, that's when you're out of the window. When you're, if you're hypervigilant, really stressed out, you might be up in red. I imagine that with the conference coming, there's probably a lot of fluctuations between these two. Hypo arousal is when you're more like spaced out, checked out. Neither of these are bad. We need them. They're self-protection. It's fight, flight, freeze. But here's the most important thing. Stress, trauma, and adversity will shrink our window of tolerance.
Right.
Right? Not just as individuals, but groups at the same time.
So right now, it's taking less to freak people out.
Exactly.
It used to be like some big thing, and unless there was something major, you were pretty calm. You weren't spaced out. You weren't super fight or flight. You're just like, okay, we can handle this. Now it's like a little thing, and people are screaming about spilt milk. They're going crazy about the toilet roll in the supermarket. It is the narrowing of that window of what they're able to handle. And that's Absolutely. A very interesting situation to lead in, to be leading a major venture in, because it's like, okay, how do I help people stay in? Because it's some small thing will happen. I said, guys, the website went down for 10 minutes. It's okay. It's cool.
Right.
It's not the end of the world. We don't need to make this into the biggest thing ever. And it's very easy for things to become the biggest thing ever. To become overwhelming, to become crazy when that window of tolerance is shrunk just from COVID and life and people being under-resourced generally. Someone interviewed me yesterday for the conference, and they've been on lockdown for months. They were in Australia, in Melbourne.
Yeah.
You could just see she was ready to go,
Yeah.
I was like, I'm not going to upset this person. I didn't want to say anything because I could see it wouldn't take much to tip this woman.
And once you're out of your window, life is different. For a person, for a community, it is really hard. And you're right, it's a really hard time to lead. I often think of dysregulated route, like when you're cycling on either side of the window, it creates a lot of polarization. I think of leaders right now who are trying to kind of find some middle ground, and the system is just oscillating back and forth between too much and too little. It's such an intense time to lead. So then, Mark, I'll ask you, it's like, here you are in the position you're in. And your window is going to be key to actually keep the ship running. So what's helping you these days to keep your window somewhat cracked open? Do you have a book in there that you're just trying to keep the window, or what's happening?
Yeah, definitely. I'm doing 3 hours a day for my own resilience.
Oh,
Um,
good.
Walking in by the sea helps me a lot. Swimming the sea, walking by the sea, walking barefoot on the grass, meditating every morning, exercising every day, at least an hour of coaching and therapy a day. So I'm getting to vent to someone else, and then just the basic physical stuff, eating well, getting a good night's sleep. Um, there's a whole program of sort of basic stuff and more advanced stuff, but
That's
just
great.
about the right side of it. A few people have said to me, given that you're 5 days away from this huge conference, you look okay. And I'm like,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm not quite. I mean, tell me what you think. I'm not quite I'm more stressed than normal, but
of course.
I'm not freaking out.
That's
And,
great.
and that's mostly, I think, because of the self-regulatory practices and some very good people I have around me. I want to give credit there. I'm
Absolutely.
lucky in that way. I'm resourced, right? I can afford the coach. I have this training in my background. There's people who don't.
Yes, absolutely. So to me, this is where it's at when it comes to embodiment and trauma. It's that you have, Mark, you have tools that you've been developing over decades now. And for meditation teachers I'm working with, it's giving them the tools that can empower others. So the best news I hear is when a meditation student goes, I was really stressed out and I used this tool, whether it was the breath, I went for a walk. You have yours that you found. Everyone's going to be different. Quick story. Do you know Sharon Salzberg, the
Yeah,
meditation
she's at the
teacher?
conference. I interviewed her.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So Sharon told me a story recently where she said she was doing work around survivors of gun violence and mass shootings, and basically tools was the key word of the meditations that she was leading. It's all about empowering people with tools. And she told a story where someone had gone back to their community and the school had run a test of what would they do, like basically a fire drill for if there was an active shooter, and the person had a panic attack. I know it's crazy.
The fact that you guys do that as normal, I just want to take the stand for saying, what the fuck,
I
right?
know it's not
That's the
normal.
thing that has to happen in the States.
Yeah.
Like it needs someone from another country to say, guys, this is not a normal thing. That episode of South Park where there's so many school shooters that it becomes normalized.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm from Canada. And so when I came down here at first, there was, what I could tell is there's a fatigue that's come with it. I'm with you. And after, which is actually related to trauma, when there's situation after situation where there isn't actually some kind of different outcome or change, there's a feeling of freezing, hopelessness, and isolation that happens for a number of people, almost like it's deep a level of immobility and frustration around it. So anyway, I'm with you. But Sharon told the story about how the person had tools and goes, I have tools in this moment that I can use. That's what this is about. It's not like, here you are, Mark, with this conference. 1,000 teachers, very articulate and impressive people who you could fool yourself into thinking, oh, well, I just need to be around this teacher every day for a year. They're my resilience. They're my resource. But actually the best teachers are the ones who are pointing to those tools, to those resources and resilience and say, actually, it's in you. Yeah, you can use this. I'm here to remind you of that, as opposed to becoming dependent on teachers. So that's what this work is about for me, giving people a lot of tools.
You remember Richard one time said, I've been on some workshop, Richard Strozzi Heckler, a mutual teacher colleague. And I said, yeah, I went to this workshop. It was great. He said, oh, great. Well, what can you do differently now?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was just like, oh, but it was really interesting. And he was like, yeah, cool. But what did you learn? Show me something. What's the tool you acquired? And I was like, oh, actually, I just kind of had a nice time. I didn't really learn anything.
Yes, right.
It's a great question.
Which feels like a question that I try to be in when I'm leading anything is, are people coming away impressed with me or impressed with themselves? Were they kind of wowed, like, wow, he was really, whatever, sensitive, articulate, or did they say, wow, I really learned that. Now I can take this in. And I'm trying to always shift it up to not be, to not take the focus off of me and really put it on the work. So that's a great question. I love that he asked that.
That's a nice question actually as well. What's in the middle? Is it me? Is it the work?
Aha, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
What are we centering? And what would they say about this workshop or whatever it was when they came away from it? That's a great point.
I was finding if I do a pretty good job, people say, "Oh, Mark was a great teacher." If I do a really good job, they say, "Oh, that was kind of obvious." Yeah, and I'm glad I was reminded of that. You know?
Isn't this the piece about the leaders? Like the best leaders they're sort of invisible in the
Yeah,
moments of pressure.
yeah. Everyone's just like, "Wow, we're doing a great job as a team. This is, everything's
Yes,
going really well."
the we, exactly. The we. That's amazing.
Do you think there's a risk in this going kind of too far, this work, in the sense of, years ago, I first learned about trauma from Paul Linden, one of my teachers, who's big and trauma educator. And at the time, it was really rare. It was, I was into it before it was cool. It's like being a hipster with a band. And then it kind of got popular. And I was like, at first I was like, great, I'm so glad this is getting well known. I'm so glad. And I still would like it to be just education in schools as a common thing. And certainly for any meditation teacher or yoga teacher or Aikido teacher, anyone that works with the body, should be standard. Like, why is there no module on this in every yoga teacher training? I still think
Sure.
it should
Yeah.
just be mandatory. And then I've also seen a way in which it's going a bit far. I'm seeing people beat each other around the head with it. They're
Yep.
using it, this sort of victim culture, or using it as a way to attack other people, sort of weaponized trauma. That's a kind of fairly new phenomena. So I'm still trying to get my head around what that is. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, 100%. This can absolutely go too far, and it's something that I've been concerned about. So I'm in the conversation with you. Put it that way. There's a term called concept creep. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
I've forgotten do you remember the name of the person who came up with that concept creep?
No, but I've seen it. It's
Apologies.
like violence used to mean hitting someone. Now it means saying a word someone doesn't like. Or
Exactly. So what do we mean by safety, unsafety, trauma? I mean, it's often terms used in the humanities that we're looking at, but trauma is another one. Trauma used to mean one thing, and now it can mean, that traffic jam was really traumatic. And I'm someone who I'm both interested in how political the definitions of trauma are, because they're talking about whose pain tends to be both legitimized and made visible and whose is not. So there's something really important about ways that trauma can shut people out. But at the same time, if we go too far, then we end up, everyone can be harmed, and it's actually taking away from people's agency.
it's
And
disempowering.
the sense, what's that?
It's disempowering when it's taken.
Is disempowering. Yeah. Oh, you're traumatized, or I'm traumatized. And it locks down the conversation, I think. And so, for me, so we could talk about this for an hour, but I think it's often when the conversation is happening and the whole system is out of their window, then everything does feel traumatic. Like you said, the site went down for 10 minutes or an hour. That's not traumatic. But if we're out of our window and we're completely dysregulated, it can actually feel traumatic in that moment. So I think when people are saying trauma, they're actually speaking to how it feels inside. And that's important.
And sometimes they just mean upset, though. They're saying, I'm upset
It's true.
with how we call that trauma. Because if I say, hey, David, I'm upset with you, that's a real different thing than you've traumatized me, in terms of the power I now have over you and the accusation and what that means, right? If I just say, well, I'm upset, you're like, well, you're a grown-up, Mark, deal with it. Whereas if I say, well, you know what, David, you've traumatized me.
Right.
That's, now we're in a whole different power. I just flipped the power relation right there.
Yeah. And this gets to me, the issue, the moment we're in around meaning making. And there's so much being up for grabs. I mean, to your point, I'm reading a book right now by a person named Sarah Schulman, Schulman, called Conflict is Not Abuse.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think I
Conflict
kept the
is
book just as a line. Hearing that,
right. Isn't that it? It just,
oh, we're in conflict. That doesn't mean
right.
there's abuse.
Exactly. And so I'm with you. I think it can. This is where I have to always say right up front, hey, everyone, just because I'm talking about trauma sensitive mindfulness, it doesn't mean that I don't think that people should be uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that I think we need to do away with teachings that actually can lead people to edges that are challenging and difficult. I'm not just trying to coddle people. And I'm really interested in this conversation. So it sounds like something you're seeing too, that this feeling of coddling.
I was, as soon as you came on, I was immediately like reassured, because you didn't have the embodiment of someone who's using trauma as a stick to beat people with, or using it as an excuse for their own bullshit. There's a feel to that I've come to recognize. And there's a feel for teachers like yourself, or I don't know, other people I respect in the field, David Pacelli or Stephen Porges, and I go, okay, you're not doing that. it actually is kind of interesting. It's almost like, now I'm safe. As opposed to like with the other guys, I'm like, whoa, okay, now I have to be very careful. I just entered a minefield is the feeling I get. And I don't get the minefield feeling with you or Stephen Porges or David. And it's a felt sense for me of if someone's using it in a way which is to gain power and to harm, or if they're using it actually compassionately.
Yeah. And this gets into where I'm seeing both people and communities who are starting to use the word trauma to gain power, which I actually understand and support. I'm like, oh yeah, if you've been targeted and disempowered for decades and centuries, of course you're going to pull in a term that everyone goes, whoa, hey, trauma, we need to talk about this. So this to me is being worked out on a collective scale in a big way right now around power. We talk about Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, it is up. I'm sure it will be up in the conference in a big way. People talking about power and how this plays out with the body and trauma. So, but I'm with you. It is a feeling. And I know the same feeling where I'm like, ooh, is someone going, are we going to be taking people out here? And are there people that are disposable here inside this conversation, which that's not an ethic that I hold.
It's interesting. The head of the trauma channels, trauma and social change channel, which is a wing of the conference, is a Russian friend of mine, and she's gay. Being a lesbian in Russia isn't so easy. And
right.
I kind of had to explain the situation in America and Britain. I took her aside and said, look, this is what you're going to deal with. Because she was bumping into it all the time, and we tried to make space. I think we have made space, actually, like some really good talks and, really good speakers talking about kind of like racial elements of trauma, all bodies, body acceptance, so many aspects of it. And, Julie's really made a lot of good space, which I think is very valuable. And simultaneously, she's one of the most careful, tactful, and sensitive people I know. And I still almost have like a fear for her running that department. Is someone going to try and take her out? Is someone going to bully her? Is she just going to have to deal with way more trouble, than the person running the martial arts channel? And I know she already has, if in terms of how much she's dealing with emotionally and attacks and levels of hypersensitivity. I don't envy her that department, if I'm honest.
No, and it's a powerful position to be in because trauma is being revealed, and historical trauma and trauma connected to oppression is being revealed. And so the person, I think, who's naturally in a position of authority, or even just the one who's in front of us, is often the person who will be on the receiving end of a lot of frustration or intensity. And I think this gets back to the embodiment. How do we hold that? How does anyone as a leader hold enough space and keep a big enough window to make room for the legitimate harm and pain, and at the same time have boundaries and say, I'm not just going to be a punching bag right now? And that is effing hard. That is a hard thing to do. I don't see it done very well. I don't know if I've pulled it off, but it is hard.
It's rough, Ryan. One thing I've learned is to go, okay, this isn't personal. I'm all men to you, or all white people, or all whatever the group is, right? All older people, whatever it is. I'm all I'm all men to you right now. And there's a history to that. There's a weight to that I'm not responsible for personally. So justice cannot be enacted upon me as revenge. That's unjust. There is no group punishment allowed. And I also want to be compassionate for the fact that history is there and it can't be ignored. And I think trying to hold both of those two simultaneously is a tricky thing for a leader.
This might spin us back right to the beginning around mindfulness and trauma. Actually, is when I hear you talk about that, trauma so often will pull us into the past. And trauma could be being enacted in the present moment, but anyone who knows about trauma, it's like it is often a past experience that we are re-experiencing the present moment. So this idea that time doesn't heal all wounds when it comes to trauma. So mindfulness is it's both a practice of meditation, but it's also this capacity of mind to be able to know what's happening when it's happening. So we're deeply in the present moment in a sustained way. So when you put mindfulness and trauma in the same room, we have trauma pulling us into, we could say, a past experience, and mindfulness pulling us into the present. At its best, I think, Mark, what you just named, there's room for it all. There's both a deep dignifying of the pain that's there, and also we're in real time at the same time, and we can make choices and we can be in our agency from there. So that's why I love putting mindfulness and trauma in conversation. I get into best practices, but it's a really deep conversation about how we can heal.
It strikes me that what's needed is a combination that doesn't quite exist yet. It needs to
Yes.
have the mindfulness, the trauma informed, probably some sort of therapeutic shadow projection, talking about authority figures, this kind of thing. And then the sort of more social political look at it, which just wasn't on the radar for many of the kind of Buddhists, that just wasn't their worldview. And that combination is just being born, isn't it? So if it's done clumsily, or if we bump into things with it, you know what I mean? It's early days, right? So maybe we could look at this as a sort of hopeful being born of something new and rich and an upgrade, to use that term again.
I actually think the conference is an expression of that. When I've looked and took a moment to see the different speakers and who's all come together and what's happening inside of this system that is it is now born and then it will die. It's just it'll have its arc. I think it is that expression of something that is being born right now that really can bring together all these different elements. And it is clunky and it's messy and it's hard. And there's some brilliant people doing amazing work around this. But yeah, I think this is a time where there's some struggle and some conflict. But I'm hoping that there is a real deep integration that can happen. For example, trauma work really now does have a component around social justice work. Now that can be, we can go really deep down that rabbit hole about what that actually means. But I think there's an analysis of a connection between personal and social change. And I think that's important for trauma work, that we're actually connecting those two things. It can go over the top, where I think if we're just identity politics can be a disaster.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that becomes born, where there's a deep. Do you know Rhonda McGee? I think is going to be at the Embodiment conference, and she's someone who is an amazing. She's a lawyer, African American woman who can embody both the understanding, the truth that we're all the same, and the reality that we're treated differently based on who we are. And she can hold both. And that's amazing.
I've come to the conclusion we need to hold three things simultaneously. It's like the individual in front of me, the social reality that we are treated differently and have different histories, and the spiritual reality that we're all one. And trying to hold those three things simultaneously, like David is an individual. David is also, I'm looking at your surname. Okay, there's probably some kind of history there, some kind of group membership there that I'm not yet aware of that might be worth me knowing about if we're going to work together, and maybe you've had different life experiences than me. I don't know your sexuality, for example. Like maybe that's you may have had like Julie, a very different experience than me,
right.
And you're just David.
Right.
And there's the mystical spiritual level.
That's right.
So it's like, if one of those is missed, there's a real problem.
Oh, yeah, right. There can be we bypass, right? If we're just going spiritual, then it doesn't hold a lot of water.
Spiritual bypass. If we're just going group identity, it's the social justice swamp, right? There's Ray Johnson, who I adore, who's also speaking at the conference, talks about the swamp, everyone hitting each other over the head in the swamp. And then if we just do the individual level, again, we've missed all the beautiful stuff and the social stuff.
I have one question for you there. I really feel what you're saying about those three. And the swamp that you're naming, what I see is a moment of reckoning where people are really trying to grapple with identity. And you're right, if we go way too far, if it's only group identity, if we go so far down that road that that's all it is, and we lose sight of the other two that you're naming, I do think it can get swampy. At the same time, I also see a number of people with deep sincerity, and groups too, who are really trying to work this and grapple with it in ways that I feel are so powerful and transformative, but it feels messy at times. So I'm trying to see, I'm trying to give a lot of space to it and see if this could be the next 5 to 10 years, and not just say, hey, come on, we need to be with these three. I'm trying to leave room for the swamp. And at the same time, it's I'm seeing organizations that sometimes end up drowning in the swamp, which is really painful to see because they're doing great work. So I'm curious how you're thinking about it and even how it's playing out in the conference.
For me, it's definitely that element is definitely an important part of the picture. and we are addressing it in the conference, making space for it, putting resource behind it, money where our mouth is kind of thing.
Yeah.
Leadership as well. Yeah. And I'm reluctant when I sometimes hear like reckoning. It sounds like, okay, I hear people say it has to go this way before it can go the other way and stuff like that. And I go, the whole group punishment thing. And I've also seen how some of these things play out in Eastern Europe. So I'm a student of communist history, particularly my wife's Ukrainian. And when we start looking at people in terms of group membership, say, well, he's a kulak, therefore we have to kill him because his group are evil. That ends in horror is how it ends. It ends in horror.
Yes.
So
yes.
I don't want to end on that horror. So yeah, that's
the dangerous. Right. There is danger when we're reduced to group identity going down that road. There's some really, incredibly painful histories there. So yeah, here we are. We're in it.
Whew, this is David. Geez, I feel like we could do another hour. I hope we become friends. I definitely hope I see more of you at the conference and, other professional situations. This has been good. And yeah, I need to run now. So someone waiting for me, but so I need to wrap this up. David, so when are you on at the conference? As we're going to rush this out.
Yeah, I believe the first day, it was Wednesday. I can look it up
launch
right here.
Day. So that's
Wednesday, the 14th, October 14th.
Yeah, there we go. That's 6 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. Californian time, I believe.
Yeah, I'm going to really break this all down, but specifically around mindfulness and meditation. So I'm looking forward to it.
Look at your website. It's really nicely put together. There's
cool. Thanks.
There's resources there. And that's, do you want to say and spell your name so people?
Yeah, sure. For sure. It's davidtreleaven.com. So it's David, Trelea, V as in Victor, En as in Nancy.com. Yeah, please check it out. We got a newsletter and a podcast. So.
And I do recommend David's book. Personally, I think it's been mandatory reading for anyone who's doing mindfulness, yoga, Aikido, any of those arts that work with the body. So, David, really enjoyed this. At the end of a long, good day. A nice cherry on the top. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.